afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming back after lunch. I know it's difficult to do that. It's an exciting little session we have here this afternoon. Asha is a senior lecturer at Yale U, but before that, she served as a special agent in New York with the FBI in counterintelligence investigations. And her background here is very interesting, lines up with what we've been talking about today in the cyber law, the law and international law and how it applies. The United States has gone through a couple of set of elections of controversial nature with respect to behavior from foreign states, the 2016 federal election that they had, and then the midterm election that they had as well in 2016 and 2018 respectively, have resulted in some reports that have come out, and Asha has some amazing background on this thing. She speaks at a very highly regarded analyst with CNN as well. She speaks about these matters and as a security and legal analyst with CNN as well. So I connected with Asha through our first through a contact name, Emily Branwin. Those of you. Hey? Can she hear us? Okay. You can hear us, Asha?
No, you can.
So, Russian cyber activities are part of its active measures. Now, active measures, okay, sorry. Okay, I'm being told that I need to start all the way from the beginning. Great, okay, so thank you for having me. I am happy to be here to talk to you about what kind of legal tools we have here in the United States to counter cyber activity coming from foreign states against the United States. I'm just making sure that you can continue to hear me. We have, I would call our laws kind of our toolbox. Our intelligence services, or primarily the FBI of the United States, kind of a supplemental tool that we use to apply these laws against different countries. The first thing that I have up on the screen is the primary country threats and their tactics. And the reason that I broke out these countries is that okay, it sounds like everything is going well. The reason that I broke out all of these countries is that we tend to talk about cyber as this all-encompassing term, as though it's this one thing that that countries do. And it actually takes different forms, and different countries have different objectives that they are trying to achieve in their cyber efforts against the United States. Depending on the country and the kind of activity that that country is doing, we have, in some cases, very robust tools that are well prepared to deal with them, and in other cases, we are quite lacking. And I'm going to get to that at the end in terms of where we have gaps and what we are still not quite prepared to address. But first, I wanted to go through these countries so you just get an idea of the way that this threat looks depending on the country. So first with Russia, their cyber activity really falls under a big category called active measures. Now, active measures have been in place against the United States since before computers, before the Cold War. They really refer to any kind of intelligence activity that's intended to subvert the United States, to weaken our internal fabric, to cause chaos, destabilize society. And we've seen, many of those efforts that have taken place in the last couple of years, but that's actually something that they've been trying to do for decades. The ability to use cyber tools has greatly enhanced their ability to undertake active measures against the United States in certain respects. For example, the hack and leak. We know, for example, with the DNC server that they were able to hack into that, and they were able to weaponize that information in strategic ways to further their own strategic objectives. Also, disinformation and perception management. Perception management is actually something that I worked specifically when I was in the FBI. I did counterintelligence investigations, and perception management refers to any activities undertaken by a foreign intelligence service that is intended to shape the opinions and attitudes of the target country in a way that's favorable to the host country. This is typically taken the form of propaganda. Again, this is not new, but what the internet and social media has done is really enhanced both the speed and the capabilities that other countries can employ this tactic and the effectiveness of it because of the reach that they have in a way that analog media did not before. Next we have China. Now, China has different goals than Russia. They're not trying to destabilize the United States or to weaken it from within, but what they are trying to do is gain an economic advantage. So they target primarily firms and private companies. They engage in economic espionage, theft of trade secrets, and again, the ability to, now that so much of this data and information and intellectual property is maintained on computer systems, hacking allows them to obtain that in a way that is in some ways more efficient than how they might have had to do it before, which is through human sources, stealing stuff directly, big bags of paper or something from the company. They can go right into those systems. Iran, this is about destabilizing, but I think not so much not to the magnitude that Russia does, but really to attack critical infrastructure, distributed denial of service, just basically making things shut down. And they are also, this is actually quite alarming, they are also on the rise in terms of disinformation campaigns. In fact, Facebook, for example, has recently taken down some exorbitant number of fake accounts that were linked to Iran. And so I think that one of the things that we're seeing from Russia and the election in 2016 and 2018 is that other countries are taking note that this is an effective tactic to use in the United States. And so I think we're going to see disinformation on the rise. Now, North Korea, the most famous one that people know about is the Sony hack. This was the hack into Sony when they were about to release a movie. It was a parody of their Supreme Leader. They did not like that, but they went into Sony's system. They were able to disrupt. They were able to steal data. They are also involved in ransomware, so basically putting in, I'm blanking on the word, viruses, sorry, and other techniques to disable internal systems, and also cyber theft. So unlike China, which is malware, thank you, Neil, sorry, I'm like, where did I totally blanked on that. I'm not a cyber investigator, so I don't take down the bots and all of that stuff. So I'm sorry that is not at the top of my list. But they're also involved in cyber theft. And unlike, China, this is so much about stealing secrets that they can use to enhance their own technological capacity, but really just stealing money. 21st century burglary is how the Department of Justice has referred to it in previous years. We can go to the next slide. Neil? Okay. Oh, sorry. You're there. Okay, sorry. So the U.S. legal framework, I divided this up into international law and domestic law. And I think that you either have already had or will have a speaker that talks about the international law piece of it. This is about how do cyber attacks fit into the way that we understand the rights and duties of nations towards each other, the laws of war. It is a new phenomenon that has to be incorporated. Okay, so Neil's telling me that you've discussed international law, but this is really an external focus. This is about one state towards another state. It requires attribution of being able to say, to point the finger and say that this other state did this. And the countermeasures that a state can take is really going to depend on how you define legal terms, international legal terms like use of force or armed attack, because that will then provide the legal basis from an international law perspective on what you're able to do back. This will include, again, international law concepts like sovereignty, necessity, proportionality. How do you do that when you're talking about cyber attacks? Does that mean that you can then respond with overt force? And these are some questions that I think international law scholars, at least, are still grappling with. So I put that to one side because that is kind of its own set of rules and ideas and concepts. I'm going to focus on domestic law. And by domestic law, I'm looking at the internal focus here. What can law enforcement, and again, our domestic intelligence, which is primarily the FBI, what can they do to counter the activities that these states are doing here, or to protect them internally from this outside interference? This is really about the state versus individual responsible actors. So these are persons. They might be persons abroad. So for example, they could be military intelligence officers sitting in another country trying to hack in, or they could be known intelligence officers or their agents operating within the United States, or entities. The United States Department of Justice has in the past indicted companies. Primarily when it comes to Russia, I have an example later that we can talk about, but this is United States versus these particular entities. One of the things that's critical here is that in order to prosecute these people or entities, it has to be a crime that is defined in the United States Code. We fortunately and unfortunately can't really go after people who do things, sometimes very bad things, but that don't necessarily cross the threshold of criminal behavior, either because, mostly because it hasn't been defined in specifically what they're doing. And I think that this is going to be a challenge, particularly on the disinformation front, which is something that there is some tension with our Constitution, but also just in terms of how we would balance civil liberties with criminalizing certain kinds of activity. And I will get into that. The other thing about domestic law in terms of prosecution is that even when there is a crime, you have to prove each element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So a crime may require 5 elements. You have to prove X, Y, Z, and A, and B, and you have to prove each of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. So for example, unauthorized access to a protected computer. You have to show that this was a protected computer, that the access was unauthorized, that it was done in a particular way. And that can be a high burden to meet, especially when you are dealing with sometimes these remote actors who are actually in a foreign country and operating from there. Particularly when they are intelligence entities that are doing it in such a way that the whole point is to not leave any digital fingerprints. So that can be a challenge. The good news is that to the extent that they can be charged and that the crime can be proved, there are criminal penalties. The question is, are they? Can we get them over here? In the Mueller investigation, for example, we have charged Russian nationals with hacking, the GRU, the Russian military entity, but they're sitting over in Russia. There's not going to be any realistic way to get them over here and get them in jail. But it does, at least in indicting them, send the message that we are able to track what they're doing, and it in some ways can be a warning to them. So I'm going to the next slide. So here we have legal remedies for different kinds of cyber activity. And what I put up here is the two areas which I think we have a fairly good toolbox. And so on the one hand, hacking and intrusion, and on the other hand, cyber theft, and I'll go through each of these. I just mentioned with hacking and intrusion, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is what I would say are probably the most common statutes that would be charged if the Department of Justice is able to get evidence on all the required elements. Unauthorized access to a protected computer, computer fraud and abuse, identity theft, the hacking itself can be a crime. And on the cyber theft piece, I called it cyber theft because of what the distinction I made between North Korea, basically just stealing money and doing it with a very specific economic goal. But here we are looking at very specific crimes again, economic espionage, theft of trade secrets. And I want to point out that that has been a critical threat that has been on the FBI's radar for a while, even apart from the cyber aspect of it. I would say probably going back 2 decades, I think there was an assessment that China, compared to what China spends on research and development, it is 30 years ahead of technologically from where it should be based on its spending, and which is likely coming from the fact that they are stealing a lot of that intellectual property, those trade secrets. And so that has been on the radar, and to the extent that what used to happen, and I think a lot of what still happens, quite frankly, was the use of human sources. A big challenge was actually getting companies to understand that this is a problem, that they had people in their companies who might be targeted and recruited in order to steal this. As I mentioned before, to the extent that you can just hack it and take it, that can be more efficient, and it exposes the intelligence service or China to less intervention from law enforcement and counterintelligence. But that has been, I think that we are fairly robust in what we can do in that area. And I have conspiracy down at the bottom. Conspiracy is every prosecutor's best friend, because what conspiracy requires is an agreement between 2 or more people to commit a crime. So any of these crimes that I've put up here can be a part of a conspiracy. So conspiracy to commit economic espionage, conspiracy to commit computer fraud and abuse. And in that way, you're able to actually bring many more people into the umbrella who can be charged. And as long as each of those people did one overt act, no matter how small, in furtherance of the conspiracy, they can be liable for the entire conspiracy. As long as they know the objective of the conspiracy, they agreed to it and they did something. Even like hit a keystroke, they knew that they were doing that to try to hack, you're in the conspiracy. So conspiracy is a very useful tool for prosecutors to bring in a large group of people under one umbrella, and we'll see some examples of that in the next few slides. Okay. So I added the middle ground here of sanctions and expulsions, because these are, they're not quite legal. They don't fit into the legal toolbox that I was talking about before. You're not prosecuting them, but they do belong to the discretion of the United States in whether to employ them. So to that extent, they're not necessarily subject to international law or international laws of war. They're really diplomatic norms that can be or the internal foreign policy of the United States that can be used as leverage or to punish outside actors. So sanctions, on the one hand, they can be by executive order. The president can issue an executive order declaring sanctions. We did this against North Korea after the Sony hack. Or sanctions can be passed by Congress, as we've done with Russia, where they're just certain actors or certain kinds of activity that the state is prevented from participating in. This is really a great tool for the United States because the United States controls so much of the banking system, and because other countries, particularly countries like, say, North Korea or Russia, are so dependent on being able to utilize our financial system or to have access to it, or if we threaten to cut off any of our business with a bank that does business with any of these countries, those banks they want to play with us. And so we can have a very strong hand here. This can be especially effective if it is kind of happening on multiple levels along with, perhaps an implicit threat of force. I think that this is traditionally kind of the strategy that we've tried to follow with North Korea is, sanctions, don't make us do anything really bad, because you don't obviously want to go full force with military action, which can escalate things, and that would go very badly, especially given where North Korea is right now militarily. So this can be kind of a middle ground there. The other piece that the United States can use are expulsions. These are basically declaring diplomats of foreign countries as persona non grata. Diplomats are here basically at the pleasure of the United States. We invite them to come, they invite our diplomats to come, and importantly, foreign intelligence officers are typically here under diplomatic cover. So the spies from other countries are basically diplomats. They're like the cultural attaché for Russia or whatever. And the FBI knows who they are. The counterintelligence side of the FBI has primary jurisdiction to identify, monitor, and neutralize foreign intelligence activity, which means that they are always keeping tabs on, or at least trying to, the intelligence activities and the intelligence officers from these countries. So we know who they are, and it is really the decision of the executive branch to basically kick somebody out, or kick a country's spies out if they behave very badly. This is highly embarrassing to the country that is being, it's called PNG. So the country being PNG, this is incredibly embarrassing to them. And so, this is kind of a high diplomatic punishment that's issued. And typically it's really done, one person. I mean, that kind of sends the message. I say that because in December 2016, after the election, the Obama administration actually PNG'd 35 Russian diplomats as retaliation for their interference in our election. And so, 35 you may not know what to do with that number. That was the strongest response ever by the United States to basically a cyber attack on the United States, and it sent a huge message. Now, why don't we do this more often? Because it can actually really harm that country, because when you're kicking out their spies, what you're also doing is disrupting their intelligence networks here. They're handling sources and assets, and the next thing you know, we put them on a plane and sent them away. We've now disrupted their intelligence gathering capabilities, in addition to, humiliating and punishing them. The problem is that the way PNG works is there's typically a tit-for-tat response. Which means that when one country kicks out a diplomat for spying or for doing something very bad, that country says, oh yeah, and then they kick out one of our CIA officers who is there under diplomatic cover. So we end up also disrupting our own intelligence efforts in that country. So that is the cost of it, and it is also partly why it is rarely done. I will add on that front, just to give, because I think most people don't really understand how this works behind the scenes, precisely because the tit-for-tat can be incredibly consequential to our own intelligence infrastructure. When Obama expelled those 35 diplomats, they did that after careful calculation of the blowback that we were going to get. And that is why, you know, all of this whole storyline in the Mueller investigation that, you know, that Putin was secretly told not to retaliate was actually a bad thing. Because to some extent, that request to not retaliate was done with an implicit promise that maybe there would be some easing of sanctions. And that didn't happen because Congress passed bipartisan sanctions against Russia. And then in response, they kicked out 775 of our diplomatic personnel from Russia, which basically devastated not just our intelligence capabilities, but also our diplomatic infrastructure. And, you know, I suspect that that was a larger tap for the tip than they would have done had they just done it organically on its own. Precisely because it has so many different effects, diplomatically, intelligence, this requires coordination between the Department of State, the CIA, and the FBI. I have only been involved in one PNG, and it was a lot of fighting between the State Department and the CIA and the FBI, because really the FBI is looking at it from the law enforcement perspective and saying this person is a really bad person and is doing bad things and they need to go, and the State Department doesn't want to ruffle any feathers, and the CIA is worried about what's going to happen to them. So there's just a lot of kind of bureaucracy that goes back, which is why, again, it's significant when it actually happens. Okay, so I'm going to turn to disinformation, leaks, and the First Amendment. You know, I mentioned before that with regard to hacking and intrusion and cyber theft and economic espionage and all of that, we have a pretty good toolbox. We have statutes. We kind of know that if we catch these people and we get the evidence, we actually have ways to prosecute them. And as I said, it's partly because we have adapted to the threat over time. We've known that economic espionage is a problem. We've seen how it's moved over to, you know, the cyber realm, but we've been able to adapt. I would say that when it comes to disinformation, leaks, and when I say leaks, like leaks that come from hacking of personal information that is then weaponized against individuals or to disrupt our processes in the United States, we are incredibly ill-equipped to handle it. And I think this is for a number of reasons. First is the First Amendment. And both the First Amendment as kind of a legal, you know, I don't want to call it a barrier because I love the First Amendment, but basically a rock that we adhere to, but also because the way that we think about information in this country is profoundly affected by the First Amendment. We have a philosophy that is ingrained in our culture that more speech is always good. This is what our jurisprudence is based on, that speech begets more speech. And the philosophy here is that we have a marketplace of ideas, and that the more ideas you get in there, the better, because they're just going to compete with each other, and ultimately the best ideas will always win out, because people will vote with their feet, or they will echo them or repeat them. The marketplace of ideas doesn't actually work as well when you introduce the digital realm, and particularly social media. And that's because these platforms allow for artificial amplification of particular ideas and suppression of other ideas that would not normally happen. But we have a lot of trouble kind of getting our minds around that because of our presumptive support for the First Amendment. But the First Amendment also actually restricts our ability to even investigate disinformation or perception management operations, to use a technical term. And again, I mentioned that I had done this, and it's very hard. So first of all, the FBI has something called the Attorney General Guidelines. These are the set of rules that are promulgated internally that lay out how the FBI can conduct investigations. And if you know anything about the FBI's checkered past in the 1960s and the 1970s, under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI wasn't so cognizant of civil liberties. They were spying on Vietnam War protesters and civil rights activists and politicians and people who were dodging the draft or whatever. And so, as a result of all of that information coming out in the church hearings, the Attorney General guidelines came out of that. And one of the key pieces of the Attorney General guidelines, especially on the counterintelligence side, which is where this would be investigated, disinformation and perception management, is that there is a huge bubble of protection for anything involving First Amendment activity. In other words, you cannot intrude on anyone's First Amendment expression. And to the extent that you can really link it to a hostile foreign intelligence service, you might be able to, but the bar is very, very high. I've read accounts in articles that on November 8th, 2016, the FBI was sitting in their headquarters. They have this thing called PSYOP at the top of FBI headquarters, which is just TV screens everywhere. And they were just looking at various Facebook accounts and just seeing these Russian troll accounts completely, just drowning out everything that was happening on social media. And there was really nothing they could do. They can't, we're not a totalitarian state, they can't shut down Facebook, they can't order Facebook to do anything. So this is one hurdle that we have on investigations. In terms of the hacking and then leaking, in terms of, so a foreign state gets information, they find highly embarrassing stuff, then they give it to an outlet to publish. Again, our First Amendment gives broad protection for the press. And there's typically been a norm of non-prosecution for when legitimate news outlets publish newsworthy stories, even if it's coming from stolen or illegally leaked sources. And there's New York Times versus the United States, which basically held that the United States could not exercise prior restraint. The United States cannot prevent a newspaper from publishing it, though it left open the question of whether, after the fact, these entities could be prosecuted for, say, violating the Espionage Act if they were releasing classified information. I'm going to give the most recent example of that. And typically, the Department of Justice has chosen not to go down this route. They don't want to get into the thorny First Amendment litigation that would result. But we may start seeing a change in that area now that we have bad actors posing as journalists. The other thing is the lack of regulation of social media. These are platforms that are basically expected to self-police. I don't know if you watched any of the hearings of Facebook on the Hill. It was very embarrassing. I would say that most of our legislators don't even have social media accounts, and many of them were still calling it the Facebook. They didn't understand the revenue model. So, we are very far behind in coming up with any adequate regulation, and whether or not even we want it, but it is basically the Wild West right now. Unlike, say, television and radio, where there is regulation. For example, if there's political content on television, if there's a political ad that's going to be on television, there is a stand by your ad law, which requires the candidate to approve of the message in the ad. So you've probably seen these during election time, like, I'm so-and-so, I approve this message. That's required by law, and that kind of keeps things on the up and up and honest, but that does not extend to social media. And then the neutrality of and access to platforms. Basically, Twitter, Facebook, all these places say, look, we're not responsible for the content. We're just here, anybody can come on, and we are now seeing some of the challenges of that because they have a lot of fake accounts. They're highly populated with them. This also makes them a lot of money, so it goes against their bottom line to get rid of them. And they also benefit from virality, so disinformation tends to travel faster, actually, because it's more exciting and salacious or whatever it is, and they get money from that. So we have a tension here between the economic model that these social media platforms are built on and you know, what we might need in terms of having ethical standards or self-policing content or doing things to prevent disinformation. And then the Federal Election Commission has not brought social media into its purview, and that goes to the example that I just mentioned before about political ads and all of that, which is partly why Russia was able to kind of flood Facebook with fake political ads in the 2016 campaign. So, I have right here 2 case studies for disinformation and leaks. And it's just to kind of give you an idea, I just mentioned that we don't have a great toolbox, or there have been these First Amendment barriers. How we dealt with that recently. And so the first is the Russian disinformation and social media operation during the 2016 election. In February of 2018, Robert Mueller, the special counsel, issued an indictment against 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian companies. So that's, I was mentioning before that we can prosecute companies. We prosecuted 3 Russian entities. These were basically, and the major one, the Internet Research Agency, is Russia's troll farm. And if you don't know what the troll farm is, it's basically a 4-story office building that employs a couple of hundred people who work in 12-hour shifts, and their entire job is to create fake accounts, harass people, you know, basically cause chaos, spread fake news, amplify content that Russia wants out there, and that's their job, and they get paid for it. So that company is affiliated, is run by an oligarch who is close friends with Putin, and that was so they were seen to be operating at the direction of the Russian government. And when Mueller brought this indictment, it was very interesting because, as I just mentioned, I mean, how do you prosecute someone for putting fake accounts on Facebook? You know, especially they're not here. It's not like they're foreign agents that are walking around here. They're doing this from St. Petersburg. They kind of went to some tried and true statutes. Wire and bank fraud, always a go-to. Basically, if you have to use your computer or pick up the phone or do anything, it becomes the federal jurisdiction applies, and if you're doing it to further any kind of fraudulent activity, that constitutes wire fraud. And bank fraud, I think because of how they were transferring money, they were presenting fraudulent information to banks. Aggravated identity theft, because they were actually pulling, photos, identities to create these accounts of real people. Actually, one American was indicted in California for helping provide these false identities to Russian operatives, though he apparently did not know that he was helping Russians. He just thought he was committing everyday identity theft. But he was the only American that was indicted as a part of that. But the big notable thing that lawyers took note of in Mueller's indictment was that they wrapped this up in a conspiracy to defraud the United States. And this was kind of a novel approach. This is a crime. It is a conspiracy to defraud the United States, but the theory behind it was that in creating these fake accounts and being out there trying to influence public opinion or influence how people voted, that they were defrauding the United States of a legitimate or, the integrity of the electoral process. I think that I like it, but I think that there were definitely some prosecutors and some legal scholars who thought, I don't know, that could be kind of tenuous. But it kind kind of speaks to the fact that there really isn't anything directly that Mueller could have charged that goes to the heart of the actual activity that they were doing. The second case study I have here is Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And this was just a couple of weeks ago that the Department of Justice issued a 17-count superseding indictment. They had already indicted him for aiding and abetting in hacking and intrusion, but this was actually about his receiving classified information from Chelsea Manning, defense information, and then releasing it through WikiLeaks. Now, Assange has presented himself, and at least during the time when these releases happened, the information that was provided by Chelsea Manning, he was presenting himself as a media outlet, which, as I had mentioned before, the Department of Justice has typically not gone after. They've gone after the leaker, in this case Manning, but they have typically not gone after the outlet. One thing that's notable is that following the intelligence assessment in 2016, the CIA basically designated WikiLeaks as a non-state intelligence arm of the Russian government. So in some ways, their journalistic bona fides were, off the table, but they were still charged with, under the Espionage Act, of receiving national defense information, of obtaining it, and for disclosing it. And so this caused a lot of consternation among journalists who said, look, there is technically nothing in the law, the espionage law as it's written, that would distinguish WikiLeaks from, say, the New York Times. And so if the Department of Justice can go after him, if they're going to go after him, then what they're doing is saying that they can also prosecute us. Let's say somebody wants to blow the lid on the government and give us, the secret detention camps for migrants or something like that. We can then be sued also. What I would say is the Espionage Act is a very poorly written law. It was written in 1917. It's very broadly written in the sense that it does not define or exclude any particular class of defendants from prosecution, or it doesn't say who's a legitimate journalist or who's not. It's just like anybody who obtains classified information is breaking the law. I think that the law needs to be rewritten, but I do think that here what they did in this indictment was they took care to show that Assange in this case was not simply a passive recipient of some kind of whistleblower information. He was actively trying to direct, encourage, solicit this person to do the hacking, and that once he got it, he knowingly and willfully disclosed the identities of many human sources who were assisting our military in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, putting them in great danger. And he did that even after he was warned by the State Department that doing that would put them in danger. And so this kind of wanton disregard for that, even when it wasn't relevant to the newsworthiness, I think kind of puts him in a different category, because in most cases I do think the New York Times would probably try to take measures to protect innocent people, even if they were going to publish that information anyway. But just know that this is a tricky area, and as we get more bad actors who are involved in this kind of thing, either as as middlemen, like the fence that's getting the stolen information from Russia, as Assange did for the DNC emails and releasing them, I think that we will see more of these kinds of bad actors posing as journalistic entities. So I'm going to close up here with just kind of where we are in terms of legal challenges to countering information warfare, which again I think is really the frontier that we are at in terms of not having an adequate toolbox. The first is, and this is kind of coming from lessons from the Mueller report, which I would encourage you to read, or at least read the Russian activity section, because it's very illuminating in terms of what they were able to investigate and how they were able to charge them with particular crimes. But there is a tension between counterintelligence and criminal investigations. I think this is probably largely true across the board. Counterintelligence investigations, you're relying on sensitive methods and sources. You might be relying on FISA information. You might have double agents that are telling you what's going on. And in criminal investigations, when you charge someone, you have to lay all your cards out on the table. You have to tell the defendant how you know what you know. And this can be a really tricky position for the government. I will say with regard to intelligence actors or agents in the foreign intelligence agents inside the United States, the FBI is primarily monitoring them and neutralizing them in ways other than criminal prosecution for precisely this reason. They don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. So they're not going to typically make it in. And this troll farm indictment is a good example, because Russia did not send, the members of the troll farm over to be tried. What they did do is hire lawyers here to challenge that, to basically challenge the charges. And so because defendants here are entitled to discovery, the legal fight that is happening right now is that the troll farm, which again is basically an arm of the intelligence arm of Russia, is demanding that Mueller hand over all of his sources and methods of how he discovered what they were doing, which he doesn't want to do. So there's a little legal battle, because technically as defendants they are entitled to that, and so there's some balancing. They're going, the lawyers can go into rooms and look at it, but they can't take anything out. So that's a kind of a whole tricky thing that's going on. The Foreign Agent Registration Act is basically the only real law we have that would work against disinformation, but again, that is for human people who are here, who are working on behalf of a foreign power and have not declared themselves to be doing so. Maria Butina, who's a Russian spy, was charged under this, and that again becomes it's a relatively weak statute to begin with. It's like the only one to use, but it's obviously not even applicable when people are conducting their operations from abroad and through cyber means. Bringing social media under the regulatory framework of the FEC, that can address some of the political issues that we saw in 2016. That still has not been done. There's been no law passed, though Facebook says that it's voluntarily going to make political ads state, who is behind them. And this is an important one. Creating mechanisms for valuating information for purposes of campaign finance laws. So, we have laws that prevent contributing things of value that can benefit candidates or campaigns. But the thing of value has to be at least $5,000. And where we are right now, this is in the Mueller report, Mueller says, look, we know that Russia offered money or offered emails, dirt, to this campaign, but they had other legal challenges like proving intent and all of that stuff, but they said a huge problem here is we have no way of placing a value on the email. There's no, it doesn't fit into the way that we have traditionally looked at things of value. It's not a financial contribution, it's not a trip to, Italy, or some kind of in-kind contribution or service, and so that was a big roadblock there. And the last thing is that similarly, we have the National Stolen Property Act. So this would, for example, could have made WikiLeaks into a fence, somebody who receives and then distributes stolen information. Or someone who's trafficking in stolen information. If you knowingly receive stolen information, not stolen information, if you receive stolen goods, you can be prosecuted under the National Stolen Property Act. The problem is that information does not fit into the current definition of tangible things, which is goods, wares, or merchandise, under this act. And so as a result, again, Mueller said, we really couldn't make the information that was being trafficked, offered, or received, or fenced fit into this law, so we really couldn't bring any charges, as if this was actually stolen property. So that's one thing that, an update to the law could incorporate. That is it. I apologize again for the technical difficulties at the beginning of this, but I hope that that gives a general overview of how the Department of Justice and the FBI approach some of these cyber challenges. I think we're mostly on target or even ahead of the curve in some areas, but I think in others we're not. And I think that to the extent that this particular talk was about elections, I do think that the disinformation piece and social media is going to become more and more important, especially as more bad actors, like I said, Iran, I think there are going to be other countries as well, start getting in on the game, and we need to be able to counter that effectively.
Amazing, Asha, thank you
so
so
Neil
much.
is typing, and I know he said that there might be some questions, so I'm going to wait here and see if
Asha, can you hear us? Or did you turn down your volume? Okay, I'm just going to see here. Can you hear us? Yay. Talking.
Okay, so he says, I cannot hear you, so I'm relying only on what I am seeing here. So it says, sounds like the challenge that James Clapper once said at the Cyber Spy Conference. Is this the correct? Okay, so we had an inclination to be very precise, very limited, very surgical, legalistic. You cannot be assured that the adversary is going to be similarly. Absolutely. And I think that our adversaries actually take advantage of that fact. So, to use this disinformation example, the irony here is that these are repressive regimes, Iran, Russia, that don't have a robust First Amendment. They think it's a weakness that we do, and they exploit that. They exploit that loophole by using this tactic. The troll farm, they know that we have very clear due process rights, that defendants have rights. They have the right to see the evidence and confront their witnesses, and they're using it against us. They know that that is a way that they can perhaps get intelligence or get an upper hand with us. And I think that they are, and I know this to be true of Russia, they're quite savvy about our laws and what they can do that can carefully skirt the line of criminal behavior. And I think that a lot of what people have been grappling with and a lot of what I have gone on TV to explain is people look at things going on and they say, that has to be illegal. And I say, well, technically, it may not be illegal. A lot of it is illegal, don't get me wrong, but there are some things that don't quite cross that line. So, yes, and I mean, remember that for our adversaries, we can be their number one enemy. They will focus all of their energy on us, whereas for us, both law enforcement-wise and counterintelligence-wise, we have to have a focus on all of these countries and all of these threats, which disperses our resources and our ability to really focus on any one in particular. Okay, there's another question I see.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm wondering, has she any premonition as to whether China or North Korea will attempt to interfere in the upcoming federal election?
China or
North Korea.
will interfere with the next federal election?
Yeah, upcoming U.S. federal election. I was wondering if she's aware of any strong concerns.
Got it. Let's see what she says. Can you hear us at all?
Do I have any premonition on if China or North Korea will interfere in the following U.S. federal election? That's a good question. I actually don't think China will. Like I said, I think that, to my knowledge about their intelligence priorities, it is fairly economic focused. I don't doubt that they could, but I think that they are more focused on gaining the economic advantage. And really, in the long term, that is a bigger threat to the United States. I mean, if you just look at the arc of what it would mean for the United States to lose its economic advantage based on its own technology and innovation and all of that. North Korea, I really don't know. I mean, you know, what Russia did, and I think what Iran's doing, is not super sophisticated in terms of their disinformation. And like I said, these neutral platforms and social media make it quite easy. But you know, while North Korea definitely has like their hackers that they can use to hack, I don't know if they have the kind of infrastructure that, say, Russia has, like that troll farm where just people are just working day and night, and that is just their primary tool. I mean, they do that not just in the United States. They did it in Europe. They practiced for a while in, Ukraine and Estonia. I mean, they've been doing this for so long, they've quite perfected it. So we were like their, fifth or sixth victim or something like that. I don't know that if North Korea can do it on the same scale in terms of that kind of interference. In terms of hacking and potentially leaking and weaponizing information, I think they could if they were savvy enough to kind of figure out the right targets. Okay, got one more.
Can she tell us anything about the U.S. sub-operation against the Russian troll factories in Petersburg and the attack on the Amazon servers in Sweden?
So you used thoughts on cyber ops in St. Petersburg?
Against the troll factories in Petersburg, and during this operation, the attack on servers in Sweden. Would be very interesting.
Which operation in Sweden?
It was 2 days before the Congress election last week.
I just see N is typing, so I'm eagerly awaiting
The other operation?
with the little bubbles going around.
The Congress election.
Okay. Could you share your thoughts on U.S. cyber ops against the troll factory in St. Petersburg and during the other operation 2 days before the congressional election in Sweden? I don't know much about that. I'll be quite honest with you. Was that, I think, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm trying to rack my brain to understand. I think, was that where did they shut down the troll factory? I mean, I know that with the indictment, what was really crazy about it, yeah, they shut, so, and this is partly why I think that Troll Factory is trying to challenge Mueller in court and understand, is that the amount of detail about what was going on inside the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg that was laid out in the indictment was something that our United States intelligence community would have to have had very sophisticated sources or to be able to reach it, because they were like describing things that were happening inside. So I do think, and that would probably be, that's an NSA thing, and I love the NSA. I never quite understood how they did what they did, but what they did was quite amazing. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do, but in a more coordinated fashion. I mean, just doing those kinds of, cyber operations back isn't going to be enough. We do need to have the prophylactic and the infrastructure here, as well as the awareness. So ultimately, I will say this, and I know that this is my last question, so it's a good note to end on, that perception management disinformation, because it's effectively propaganda, it only works as long as people do not know that they are being duped. The way to neutralize disinformation and propaganda, the best way is actually not necessarily to get rid of it, but to make sure that people identify it as disinformation or propaganda. And this is the whole idea behind the Foreign Agent Registration Act that was created in 1938 as a way to counter Nazi propaganda. And what it does is it actually doesn't criminalize any content or require removal of any content. What it requires is that if anything is propaganda, if anything is being put out by a state, information, that it has to be clear to the consumer, to the people consuming that information, that it is coming from the state. because the consumer will actually psychologically absorb information differently if they know that it's coming from the Germans versus their next door neighbor organically. And so I think neutralization and exposure is a key factor in creating the kind of digital and media literacy that allows people to start identifying this better. I think it's going to be unrealistic to actually get rid of it. So I think that's it. Thank you again. I wish I could have heard these questions or been able to see what was going on out there. And I hope this was helpful in kind of giving a big overview of how we approach this. And I really appreciate you letting me be a part of this event.